I'm just very impressed with the crowd and appreciate your attention, audience. My presentation tonight is to give you a quick rundown on some of the implications of the Green Energy Act. This is just something that has gotten completely out of control. I think it's not going to take too much to see some of the flaws. What we put in replacement for the Green Energy Act is going to be a lot more difficult. The presentation gets into a couple of areas. I address some of the background in terms of the public discussion we've had and how we got to where we are from the point of view of the major issues that have come out driving the policy decisions. I give you a very quick overview of where the provincial government's current plan is at with respect to what they want to do with our power system, a little bit of retrospective of how the current plan compares with the plan that they published just a couple years ago, so you can see the transition. Spend a few minutes looking over the challenges that wind power specifically as one component of the overall power system, how this component is likely to impact our power supply and why. And finally, I want to broaden the discussion to point out that it's not just wind power that's a problematic issue for our electricity future. We face a really complicated, difficult electricity future. None of this is going to be simple. And so the point at the end is to broaden the scope, just to give you a sense for what I see as some of the challenges going forward. We got into this Green Energy Act for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons was that we had a very undisciplined, careless public discussion about energy issues. And a lot of very loose talk just seemed to get accepted and circulated as if it was revealed truth. Our newspapers repeated them, we saw it on TV and it seemed real enough, and so people just let it slide. But a lot of the basic elements of these discussions were not carefully examined. Just taking one piece of that story, coal, the case against coal became a major driver for our policy decisions with respect to electricity. The idea was that coal was a mass killer, mass murderer of hundreds of our citizens every year, that there was no such thing. The only kind of coal power you could have was dirty coal. There was no way to do anything about it except simply shut it down. And that wind power would replace coal. Each of the links in that chain is fundamentally flawed if you look at the data and if you go behind the story. But that chain of reasoning, such as it was, became one of the foundation stones for what we ended up doing to our power system. But there were many other issues that went beyond coal. The idea of, we've got problems with our petroleum supply, our oil supply for the world, so we just need something to replace all the oil. Well, of course, Ontario doesn't use these days any oil for power generation. We used to historically. Some other jurisdictions, Caribbean, for example, a couple of Canadian provinces, Newfoundland and New Brunswick, use a little bit of oil for power generation. That's problematic, but in Ontario, the oil problem doesn't have anything to do with our power supply, and much less something that we could do something about by building more wind turbines. So it was a real disconnect, but it got into the discussion. Also a lot of careless talk about what wind was capable of. The idea that if you put the wind turbines far enough apart from each other, that would smooth out the bumps in supply and the production variability. And the idea that if the wind wasn't blowing here, the wind would always be blowing somewhere. You heard this by the proponents and some of the environmental groups and whatnot over and over again. Again, none of this stuff stood up, but it got into the discussion, and we allowed this kind of careless talk to carry forward. It's not just careless science that afflicted our decision, careless finances as well. We've gotten in the habit of allowing our governments to pump millions of dollars into lobby groups, specifically aiming their lobbying back at the government ministries that gave them the money in the first place. So they cycle the money in and out. So we've turned millions of dollars of government subsidies to lobby groups into billions of dollars of contract. The Samsung contract is referred to. There's almost never a reference to the Samsung contract that appears in a newspaper article without describing it as the $7 billion deal. Well, it's $7 billion of investment from Samsung's point of view, but from the customer's point of view, it's about $20 billion in net present value impact on your power bill that we're talking about. It's not $7 billion, it's $20 billion. And that's just one small slice of an overall portfolio of these contracts. We're talking about a really staggering amount of money here. These 20-year FIT contracts under the Green Energy Act imply a portfolio of liabilities on future electricity customers that is running into very, very big numbers. And again, Samsung just one small piece of it, and it's $20 billion alone. Recently, just these crazy things that our politicians get away with saying. Our premier has been in the newspaper lately talking about responding to the criticism that Ontario is often exporting electricity to our neighbors at negative prices. We actually pay people to take this stuff off our hands because it's a disposal problem. It is a legitimate reliability concern on our grid. Having excess power is something we cannot allow. We've got to get rid of it somehow. And there are days when we pay our neighbors very large amounts of money to take this excess power that we generated at huge cost off our hands. And he's been saying, well, we're making profit on it. Hang on a second. What he's done is he said, well, we're net exporters of power now, and the revenues that we get from this net export equals so much. What he doesn't count is how much it cost us to generate that. Yes, it's true, in 2010, we got about net revenue, something like $300 million on the exchange at the border. But that was power that cost us probably over $1 billion to produce. Not profitable. Okay? And another one that just drives me absolutely bananas. And it's a foundation stone of the Liberal government's election platform for the next election in October. We just got to put a stop to this. But this idea that Ontario Clean Energy Benefit, they take 10% off your residential power bill. Well, hang on a second, who do you think is paying for that? I mean, that's a real cost. There's money that goes out the door to pay for the power that's generated, the transmission service, the reliability services, and various things that compose your power bill. 10% comes off, well, it goes straight to the provincial deficit, so our kids pay for it. That's just wrong. Ernie Eves made similar mistakes back in 2002 when he froze the electricity price. But it's a financial scam. We got to put a stop to this kind of stuff. We just can't. It's just terrible. Sorry, I think I got too excited on this. Anyway. Okay, so here's just a quick rundown on where we're at with the current power plan the government's issued. And a bunch of interesting things are going on, one of which is electricity demand in Ontario peaked in 2005, it's been declining. The government's previous power plan anticipated that power demand would be increasing rather than decreasing. we're still buying the portfolio of power that would supply us at that much higher load level, but the load's disappearing, and we're now in this ironic situation. We're actually spending a lot of money on energy conservation programs. I'm a very pro-conservation guy, but with this declining demand and this big portfolio of generation, the more we conserve, really, the higher our rates are going to go, because the revenue requirement for the power system is fixed at this point. We bought all this power whether we use it or not. So if we're consuming less power, meaning it's another factor that's driving price. The government has issued an order to the agencies that are responsible for actually operationalizing the power system. And the order is that we're going to increase the amount of wind, solar, and biomass, the so-called non-hydro renewables, by almost 5 times between now and 2018. So if you look out at the landscape and you see a lot of this stuff going on, multiply by 5. And it's having huge impacts on power prices. Okay, so this is the outlook for power prices that the government issued in its plan of 2007. They said that by 2010 we'd be paying about 10 cents for power. Actually, we're now paying almost 13 cents for power. They said that by 2014, okay, we're going to increase the price a little bit, 10.5. Actually, the current outlook is now, from official estimates, which I don't believe as far as but 15 cents for power. So 2 years ago, Ontario power prices passed the U.S. average. For 100 years, we had lower power prices than the U.S. average for homeowners. Now we've blown past them. We're headed for the stars, and their power prices are flat or declining. So his power plan has got to go too. These are just examples of some of the analytical questions that just haven't been asked. And you know, it's a real shame. We do have within the power system a whole lot of very good professionals, very well educated, very dedicated, experienced, serious folks. And they're working in agencies that really can no longer express themselves. They're at high risk of getting fired if they speak their mind. And they know that these are all important technical questions that have to get addressed, and they're just not getting addressed. One of the implications of what has happened with the politicization of the power system is that the folks that work inside the system, I mean, your heart has to go out to them. Many of them know that what they're doing is not the thing they should be doing, and they're doing it anyway because they're ordered to. Okay, so another couple slides here to show you some of the challenges that wind power represents from the point of view of maintaining a reliable supply of electricity to consumers. Here's a little slice in time. This is a 2-week period from September 4th to September 17th last year. I picked it out of the data because it was a period where the wind was particularly productive for that period, that time of the year. This is it was a relatively good period, and each of the colored lines here represents a specific day. It's on a 24-hour period. What I want you to take away from it is it's a spaghetti mess, right? The demand for power has a very regular ebb and flow. On the weekends, it's a little lower. Weekdays, a little higher. It's relatively predictable, especially in the short term. It's very predictable. And the guys that are making the grid work are dispatching the right amount of generation to instantaneously match the demand along with peace. You know, in real time, building up this supply. When you've got a resource that's just all over the place like this makes their job very tough, and that causes cost implications. A couple more slides I was going to show about some of these practical difficulties that wind power represents from the point of view of power system reliability. One of the challenges is that whereas Ontario experiences a peak of electricity demand in the summertime, we used to be winter peaking, now we're summer peaking, a lot of air conditioning. We have a secondary peak of demand in the wintertime, but the spring and the fall we have what's called a shoulder period, a period of relatively low demand. You compare that with what kind of output comes from the wind farms, what you see is, well, the good news is we get a peak of wind power output in the wintertime, but we have a secondary peak of demand. But in the summertime, there's about half the productivity from the wind farms as opposed to their productivity in the wintertime. Although we're using more power in the summer, we're getting much less output from the wind generators. There we go. Okay, hey, that's so cool. So here's a 365-day period. Here's the behavior of the demand. The blue, wild, crazy, jumping around is the output from the wind farms. They're both normalized to a 100% index, just so you can put it on the same graph. And so here is the summer period, here's the winter period. In the summer, you can see that wind power is producing very little. So on one hand, the good news is that at least wind power is delivering when we can use the power in the wintertime. The difficulty comes over here. And that is, we get all over, in the wintertime, we get the lion's share of the output from the wind farms comes on the warm days. So there's this very high positive correlation between daily temperature and daily wind output. They just dance really synchronized together. And that's bad news from the power system's point of view because we use more power on the cold days than the warm days. The next one. Here's an analytical approach to answering this question: how much benefit do you get by putting the wind farms further apart in terms of smoothing the output from the wind farms? And there's several interesting things in this study, which I did with a student at U of T together. But the results that we've identified in terms of the extent to which the wind farms start to move out of phase with each other as they get further apart, the relationship we identified from the Ontario and Upper New York State data, which is represented here, turns out to be an almost identical mathematical equation to the results that were developed from studies of similar methodology applied to the results from Denmark, Germany, UK, Alberta, California. Everybody at our latitude has almost the same effect, and that is that the wind farms, no matter how far apart they are from each other, they still are fairly synchronized in their output, even at great distances. This has a lot of implications for the guys that are doing the grid reliability task, because as you add more wind farms, the amplitude of the variability of the aggregate of all the wind farms together just keeps growing. There's no distance you can put them apart that causes the amplitude of that variability, that crazy sewing machine that we saw before, to settle down. Yeah. So wind is going to be really tough for us. Our grid is unlike Quebec, which has a lot of very flexible hydroelectric capability. Manitoba also has capabilities like that. Ontario doesn't. We got a lot of baseload generation here, and so you add this intermittent generation to our baseload, and it's just going to be a real headache for us. And the technical people, like the Market Surveillance Panel, which is an agency of the Ontario Energy Board, they're starting to recognize this. The data was available to recognize this a long time ago. But it's not just wind power that's going to be difficult for us in the future. All of our power options have issues. And so we got to have an adult conversation based on facts and kind of some due process, some ability to kind of sort things out here. Because this is all going to be hard. Here's an example of one of the challenges that solar represents. Of course, in the summertime, there's a very good coincidence factor between the output from the solar generators and our air conditioning need. You know, so that there's a nice correspondence, and that works out very favorably. But in the wintertime, it's not nearly so good. There's days in January when we're going to get a lot of solar output. Not that many days, we get a lot of cloudy periods. But if you get a bright day in January, this is what you're going to get. Okay, so the red line represents what's happening to the typical load on a weekday in January. And here is the output we would expect from a solar generator. This is actually based on Detroit data, but this is what Ontario's solar output is going to look a lot like on a bright day in January. And a key point is right in here on the graph, okay? Just as the sun goes down and the solar output all dies off, that's just exactly when our natural uplift in electricity demand is. So what we're going to get is the output from the solar is going to drop at the exact time when the demand for electricity is going to rise. Because of course we switch our lights on because it's dark, right? Well, that means that all the flexible generation that has to do this job of following the load is going to have to work that much harder. So that has cost implications, it has emission implications, it's got a lot of serious implications. And if we had a serious power plant, we could talk about stuff like that, but we don't have one, and so it's going to be a surprise when it arrives. Here's a very wordy slide, but the color basically will tell the story here. This is some of the challenges we face with our nuclear fleet. This is the World Association of Nuclear Operators data. What they try to do is they produce a nuclear performance index, NPI, that attempts to take all of the important aspects of reactor performance for individual operators and put it into a single number so that they can kind of try to see how the patterns work over time. So that the nuclear performance index includes worker radiation exposure, waste production, unplanned trips, production reliability, all these factors driven into one aggregated number. And what we see, this is the U.S. power fleet for 16 operators in the U.S. And then the Canadian CANDU reactors and the international CANDUs. And the only take-home message here is that the young CANDU reactors are fairly competitive. The old CANDU reactors really have a lot of issues. So from an international comparison point of view, we've got a long way to go in terms of improving the performance of our machines. And this is the kind of thing I think that we should enter into the discussion about if we're going to build more nuclear, what kind of nuclear we ought to build. And a final graph, and I'll just leave this with you. This is a natural gas spot price history over the last 14 years. We can go back further and tell a similar story. But the point I'm getting at here is these prices here are not inflation adjusted. So what you can see is that in the last 2.5 years, natural gas has been a very inexpensive energy source. It's been a very attractive source of fuel for power generation and other uses. In inflation-adjusted terms, the gas price in the last couple of years has been the best deal we've had in natural gas for forever. It's been really good. And that makes natural gas a very credible, competitive alternative for meeting short-term needs for electricity. But you look long-term, and we know that there's going to be huge gas price spikes in future. If we get into a lot of gas-fired generation, we're going to get really hit the next time one of these big spikes happens. So I think that's something we ought to be concerned about. We're building a lot of gas-fired generation in Ontario now. We're going to be depending on it very heavily, and it's going to be, we just know it's going to be a headache in the future. So there's my quick survey of everything to do with electricity, but we'll get into it with the questions. Thanks.